It's a great pleasure to welcome today Phoebe Pearce to give us a seminar. So Phoebe's visiting from Imperial College in London, and Phoebe did her master's course there. She took the Sustainable Energy Futures master's course, which I used to teach on when I was at Imperial College in London. And now Phoebe's studying towards a PhD at Imperial College. She's obviously working very closely with us here at SPREE now that I've moved here. But it's a great pleasure to invite Phoebe to give a seminar to us on the work that she did as a master's student. It's on the feed-in tariff policy for solar microgeneration in Great Britain, and a policy evaluation and capacity projections using a realistic agent-based model. So this is work that Phoebe performed with Raphael Slade. And Phoebe, it's a great pleasure to welcome you, and we're looking forward to your seminar.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Ned. This is work I started during my MSc in 2016 and have been working on still over the last year and a half. Sorry for the title, that's a real mouthful, but I'll just be talking about feed-in tariffs in Great Britain and evaluating policy using a model. So, an outline of the talk. First of all, I'm going to explain how feed-in tariffs worked in Great Britain, because it's not very straightforward and it's been quite erratic. Then I'll have a look at how that's affected PV installation in Great Britain. Then I'm going to introduce my model, but also agent-based modeling more generally, and explain why I chose to use agent-based modeling rather than any other modeling type. Explain how I developed my model and a lot of the background data that I used, because a lot of it's based on realistic demographic data, and then how I actually used the model to generate results. And so then I'll talk about my results, which really fall into two categories: historical simulations for policy assessment over the period 2010 to 2016, and then capacities in sort of the near to mid projections, capacity projections in the near to mid term, so up to 2022. And at this point I would just like to plug my paper, which was published literally 3 days ago in Energy Policy, and I'll have a link at the end as well, and an open access link if anyone is interested. So if there's a figure in this talk or any information which I don't cite a source for, that means it's from the paper. Any detailed references for levels of the feed-in tariff, demographic data, etc., those are all in the paper. So feed-in tariffs were introduced in the 2008 Energy Act, and they became available from April 2010. And they weren't only available for solar PV, they were also for anaerobic digestion, hydropower, wind power, and small-scale gas-powered combined heat and power. Oh, try saying that 10 times fast. Available since 2010. They were meant for small-scale systems, which they would define to mean up to 5 megawatts, but anyone who's sort of familiar with PV knows that a small-scale PV system is much smaller than that. No one's going to put anywhere near 5 megawatts of PV on their roof. So actually, although they expected people to install all sorts of stuff, 99% of the number of registered installations is currently solar PV, so there's very little of any other technology. And 58% of that solar PV is less than or equal to 10 kilowatt systems, so peak capacity less than 10 kilowatts. And throughout the talk, I'll be referring to that as small-scale small-scale PV, because it's conceivably what you could put on a roof and what a household might have. So the way it works is that there's a separate generation and export tariff that are set over time. And that's not actually paid by the government, it's paid by whoever supplies your electricity. So if you decide to install a PV system, your electricity supplier will pay you the generation and export tariff. So what's the difference between the generation and the export tariff? The generation tariff is paid over all the electricity that's produced, so it's some amount in pounds or pence per kilowatt hour. The export tariff is meant to only be paid over whatever you export to the grid. However, in practice, it doesn't really function that way, because small systems in Great Britain are not required to have an export meter, they're only required to have a generation meter. And obviously, people don't want to pay to have an export meter installed if they don't have to. So what happens in practice is that a lot of people use deemed export. So if you don't have an export meter installed, your electric utility says that you are exporting 50% of your electricity, even though no one's actually measuring it. So In practice, the feed-in tariff doesn't really work like a feed-in tariff. So in Germany, they have an actual feed-in tariff where they measure how much electricity you're putting into the grid. For small-scale systems in the UK, in Great Britain, that's not really what's happening. Once you are receiving a certain tariff, that's guaranteed for either 20 or 25 years. So right now, the guarantee period is 20 years. Before August 2012, it was 25 years. And what that means is that even if the feed-in tariff for new installations decreases, you will keep receiving the feed-in tariff as it was when you registered your installation. And as we'll see later, that's really important because feed-in tariffs used to be very high and now they're very low. And by the way, the reason I keep saying Great Britain, I might slip up and say UK at some point, but I should say Great Britain because feed-in tariffs are not available in Northern Ireland. They have just a completely separate policy that I don't know anything about. So how much has been installed under the feed-in tariff scheme? It's 4.1 gigawatts in total. So that's the graph on the bottom left. You can see it broken down by capacity. Can I get the mouse? Where is the mouse? Okay. So bottom left, you can see it broken down by capacity of the individual systems. So you can see that there's a significant chunk of capacity that's made up of quite large systems, but more than half is made up of systems that individually are smaller than 10 kilowatts. So 4.1 gigawatts peak total has been installed. That's as of October 2016. And 2.4% gigawatts of that is small systems. So from my model, I've estimated that that's currently costing about £600 million a year. There's data on how much the feed-in tariff costs as a whole, which is about £1.1 billion a year. So this seems like a reasonable model outcome for just the small-scale stuff. And you might think, oh, October 2016, that's a bit outdated, update your numbers. But unfortunately, even though we keep hearing about how well it's going with PV, the last time I checked, about 2 weeks ago, less than 100 megawatts had been installed. So we're still only at about 2.5 gigawatts. So yeah, that's why these graphs run to October 2016. You can see as well in all of them that the capacity that's installed really drops off, like it really flattens off towards October 2016. So the graph in the top right is all the installed small-scale capacity, and then what also feed-in tariff registered installations. So the reason I show this graph is really to motivate the fact that if you're only looking at small systems, by far the most important category to consider is those registered under the feed-in tariff. And the graph below that shows that almost all of those systems are domestic, so they're owned by households. So if you want to consider small-scale PV systems in Great Britain, by far the most important category to look at is households adopting PV and registering it under the feed-in tariff. At this point, I would just like to draw a little comparison with Germany, because a lot of people are probably more familiar with the feed-in tariff scheme in Germany. It's very long-running. I think it's been available since 2000. About 40 gigawatts of capacity has been installed under the EEG, and that costs about 10 billion euros a year. So very crudely, you could say, comparing the 4.1 gigawatts to the 40 gigawatts, they've got about 10 times as much capacity installed. It's also costing about 10 times as much. But it's important to consider that the German feed-in tariff scheme started much earlier when PV was still a lot more expensive. So you would really expect sort of a better return on investment for the case in Great Britain. So this is the levels that feed-in tariffs have had since they were introduced. So personally, I think this is an incredibly stressful graph, but maybe I've just spent too much time looking at it. So when they were first introduced in April 2010, you can see the generation tariff especially was very high. It was about 48 pence per kilowatt hour, and now it's very low, about 4 pence per kilowatt hour. So also note that there were two different generation tariffs, depending on how big your system was, which I'll say more about in a second. For most of the feed-in tariff scheme's existence, the export tariff was much lower than the generation tariff. Now it's actually slightly higher. But as I've said before, it doesn't really matter very much how things are divided between the generation tariff and the export tariff, because it just, in practice, functions as a generation tariff, and you get paid the export tariff over half of your generation. So I'll just explain why there are some sort of crazy jumps in this graph. In October 2011, the government announced that they wanted to cut the generation tariff by more than 50% with only a couple of weeks' notice, starting in December 2011. Unfortunately for them, that was challenged by Friends of the Earth and a couple of PV installers who said, you can't do this at such short notice. It's unlawful for you to change the feed-in tariff so drastically with only a few weeks' notice, because a lot of people have just started exploring installing PV, and now they have no certainty about the policy. So they lost the first court case, then the government appealed, and then they lost again. So there was some fluctuation, and then finally the feed-in tariffs were reduced, or the generation tariff was reduced quite drastically in March 2012. So then things got a bit calmer. There was just gradual reduction for a couple of years until the general election in 2015, when there was a consultation. The feed-in tariff scheme was paused for a month, so that's why everything goes to zero there. And when it was open to new registrations in February 2016, the feed-in tariffs were again much lower, and they'd also added deployment caps. And what that means is that only a certain amount of capacity is available for each generation tariff level, and the feed-in tariff will decrease every 3 months. But if the capacity for that quarter is exceeded before the end of the 3 months, it will decrease more quickly. So there's actually a total amount of capacity that's available under the feed-in tariff scheme. Currently, and there's no plans as far as I'm aware to extend it, the rates are set until March 2019, and there's 700 megawatts of capacity available. So if you compare that to this is all for small scale stuff, so if you compare that to the 2.4 gigawatts that's already installed, 0.7 gigawatts available is really not that much. So in the past, the feed-in tariff was higher for smaller systems, so there was just an abrupt cutoff at 4 kilowatts. If your system was larger than 4 kilowatts, you would get a lower feed-in tariff. Obviously, there are some reasons why you might want to discourage very large rooftop installations that you, as the sort of grid controller, have no control over, but this seems like quite a crude mechanism, and although I can't prove that it's entirely because of this, this is the distribution of capacities of what people have installed. So you can see that there's a suspiciously large number just below 4 kilowatts and almost nothing just over 4 kilowatts. So I would say people were certainly offered a sort of perverse incentive to install slightly less PV than maybe they would have done otherwise. Yeah. So I constructed an agent-based model to model past installation and do some policy assessment, and also to do projections. My goal really was to see, could we have achieved the same level of installation for less money, less subsidies, or could we have, with spending the same amount of money, achieved significantly more installation if things had been planned a bit better? And I also want to look at what is the likely effect of policy going to be in the future. So the reason I used an agent-based model is that most sort of large, well-established energy system modeling families are in some way optimization models. So the thing you're optimizing might change. It could be lowest carbon emissions, it could be cheapest overall cost, it could be lowest cost to the government, lowest cost to the consumer. But in some way, they're optimization models, and they frequently assume that there's some kind of centralized control over the energy system. And that might be fine if you're only considering coal, large-scale CCGT, or nuclear power plants, for instance. But it really, or even large wind farms, it's okay to assume that there's some kind of generalized control that the government can approve or not approve certain energy plants. But it's not really valid anymore if you start allowing people to put small-scale PV systems on their roof. That's just a bunch of individual, unconnected households making decisions themselves if they think that's a good idea. So agent-based modeling really provides an intuitive environment to explicitly represent this population heterogeneity, individual decision-making that might not be entirely rational, the characteristics of technology and how those change over time, and also the effect of external factors like the electricity price, or the subsidies available, or the cost of PV, and how that affects the adoption decision. So the way any agent-based model works, the basic modeling elements are the agents. In the case of my model, those are households in Great Britain. So the agents exist in some environment. This nice diagram from the book by Kung Van Dam, which is a really nice book about agent-based modeling. The agents exist in an environment in some state, and they can change their state according to decision rules. And the decision rules can depend on the agent's own characteristics, or on the environment, or on other agents which are part of their environment. And agents can act on themselves, and they can also act on each other and on the environment. So there's no sort of centralized control over the system that control the system dynamics. All of the system dynamics emerge from individual decisions. And you can set environment parameters like household income or electricity prices, what subsidies are available. You can set them realistically according to real data. So there's the structure of my model specifically. So as I said, the central modeling element is an agent, which represents a household. Maybe the most important characteristic is their status. Have they installed or not? If they've already installed PV, they can't install PV again. I mean, I suppose they could in real life, but in my model they can't. Their household income, household size, where they live in Great Britain. Most of you probably know it's not really that sunny anywhere, but it's significantly less sunny in Scotland than it is in Cornwall as well. So where they live in the UK, the load factor associated with that region, so that's average capacity divided by total installed capacity, their electricity consumption. So the reason I consider electricity consumption is that a large incentive for installing PV is to lower your electricity bill and offset your electricity costs. So you're probably not likely to install a PV system that produces significantly more electricity than you can use in your house. And also households with large electricity consumptions, generally they're high because they live in a larger house, which is likely to have more roof area, so more space for PV. The agent social network. So I've chosen to use quite a simple social network because it's not really the focus of this model. The focus of the model is assessing policy rather than investigating social dynamics in a network. So the social network is quite simple. Just in a population of 5,000 agents, there will be 10 randomly chosen. Every agent will have 10 randomly chosen connections. And the more of those people have installed, the more likely they are to install too. And then if the agent has adopted PV, and I'll explain the adoption decision in a lot more detail in a second, you have to track what generation and export tariff they're receiving and when they installed so that you can see how much you're spending on your subsidy and track the capacity over time. So the agents have their social connections and they exist in an environment. So the environment just contains information that's relevant for creating the agents and also information that's relevant for the adoption decision. So electricity price and PV installation cost are two main drivers. So the higher the electricity price, the more likely people are to install PV to avoid having to buy electricity from the grid. Obviously, PV installation cost goes without saying. Demographic data, so this is things like household income distribution, household size distribution, regional distributions of populations in Great Britain, load factor data that's associated with the region, what subsidies are available at that moment, so the feed-in tariffs that are available. Then there's the number of owner-occupiers. So this is slightly, the reason it's in italics is because it's actually slightly different from the other parameters. It doesn't affect the adoption decision in any way. It's purely a scale factor. So for just computational reasons mainly, I don't run the model with 17 million agents, which is the rough number of owner-occupiers in the UK. By owner-occupier, I mean a household that lives in a house which they own. So I'm assuming in the model that people who are renting accommodation are very unlikely to install PV on a roof that they don't own. So the number of owner-occupiers is just used to scale the model outcomes to reality. And then there are all the decision-making parameters. So if you look at the agent decision-making parameters, they're the partial utilities and the total utility. So the partial utility just means usefulness. In this model, I've used the utility function approach to model the adoption decision. And what that does is try to quantify how useful a decision is to an agent. So in this case, how useful is adopting PV to a household? And how likely are they to do it? So the factors that I've chosen to play into the decision are the household income. Obviously, if you don't have any money, you probably can't afford the PV. The payback period, so this is just a simple payback period. So it's the capital cost of the PV system divided by the annual return from your feed-in tariffs and from electricity bill savings. Social network, so how many people do you know who've already installed PV, and the capital cost barrier. And that kind of reflects that even though PV might be a good investment on paper, so it might be an investment with a positive net present value, you might not be able to afford it. So even if installing a 2 kilowatt PV system would be a great idea because feed-in tariffs are really high and you live somewhere sunny, maybe you don't have money for it. So all these partial utilities are added together in a weighted sum to make a total utility, and that's compared with an adoption threshold, which is set in the environment because it's the same for all the agents. And if your utility exceeds the adoption threshold, you'll adopt, and I'll show the sort of maths in a second. This is what the partial utilities look like. So the utility functions, these 4 functions, just take the characteristics I'm interested in, so income or number of social connections to PV installers, and turn it into a number between 0 and 1. So I'm just trying to quantify how good that particular characteristic is in terms of installing PV. So obviously you have to define these in a logical way. This is basically just arbitrary, but it has to be done in a logical way. So, for instance, the higher your income, the more likely you are to, the higher the income utility should be. But bottom right, the more expensive PV is, the lower the capital cost utility should be. The shorter the payback period, that's the economic utility. The shorter the payback period, the higher the economic utility should be. So you can see that 3 of these are these sort of S-shaped curve, which is called a logistic function. The rationale for using a logistic function is that really, okay, I don't have the mouse. The rationale for using a logistic function is that most of your agents for a lot of factors will be concentrated in a specific area. So for instance, for the income, top left, most households have an income between £10,000 and £50,000 a year. In terms of percentiles, there's actually maybe about 5% of people who are above that. So you want your income utility to be changing a lot in that region and then to kind of saturate, because you don't need to really differentiate between many agents in the region from 50,000 to 100,000 pounds a year. Similar, you can make a similar argument for the social utility and the capital cost utility. The reason the economic utility is a straight line is that same argument does not hold for the feed-in tariffs. If you look at where the feed-in tariffs have been, it's kind of all over the place. They're not like concentrated in a certain area. So if you use a logistic function for the economic utility, just crazy things start to happen. I have the equations for all of this on an extra slide, but they're also in the paper, of course. So this is the agent decision-making rule, as I said. So on the left-hand side, we have the total utility, which is the weighted sum of the partial utilities. If that's bigger than or equal to the threshold, the agent will adopt. So this is really just some definitions. I've constrained all the weights and all the partial utilities to lie in the range 0 to 1. The threshold lies in the range 0 to 1. The partial utility weights have to add to 1 because in that way the total utility is also between 0 and 1, which makes sense because we're going to compare a total utility and a threshold, so those both need to be numbers between 0 and 1. Okay, so that's great, and I've showed you what the economic utilities, the income, the social, and the capital cost look like, but what are the weights and what is the threshold? That's obviously very important. So one of the key reasons for choosing this utility function approach is that it lets you calibrate your model, and these are the things that I can calibrate, the weights and the threshold. So I will talk about that in a second, but I just want to make a quick note about the data I've used. So I just talked about how almost all incomes are concentrated in a small area. Here's my proof. This is data from HM Revenue and Customs on pre-tax household income for households in the UK. So the blue dots are the percentiles, the cumulative distribution function, and the black line is a log normal distribution that I fitted to it. So when I create an agent, I just tell the model, sample from this distribution and assign an income based on this distribution. Similarly, for the household size, this is data from the Office for National Statistics. Sample from this discrete probability distribution based on real data for the UK. Electricity consumption. Electricity consumption is a bit more complicated because it depends quite strongly on your household size and also household income, which is quite easy to explain. Obviously, large households use more electricity because there are more people and also they are likely to live in larger houses, and richer households also use more electricity. So the sampling there is done from a distribution that depends on household size and electricity distribution. What I've shown bottom right is the actual data for the UK compared with the distribution for one specific agent population of 5,000 agents. So you can see that that sort of compared that using the household size and the income to determine a reasonable probability for the electricity consumption is reasonable. Another key thing that goes into the decision making is the PV and electricity prices. So luckily for me, there's actually quite good data available for this in the UK. So when they started the feed-in tariff scheme, the government also started tracking how much people were spending on small PV systems. So that's the data you can see in the graph on the bottom. So they have monthly data on average how much it costs to install PV, and as we all know, I'm sure it's fallen a lot over recent years. We all know that. You know, we're not down in the sort of pence per kilowatt region, because this is all installation costs, right? So this includes paying someone to go up on your roof and actually install the thing. Electricity price data is also available for small consumers who are not businesses, so that's what I've used there. And for 2010 to 2016, so for the past, what I'm interested in is looking at alternative policy scenarios. So I say, you know, these are the electricity price and the PV cost, and I'm going to see what would have happened if the policy had been different. Obviously, for the future, I'm sure all of you realize that it would be quite a lot of work to also try to accurately predict what's electricity price is going to be in 2020 and what's the cost of PV going to be. You know, there's lots of people working on what's the cost of PV going to be in 2020 or 2022. So I've basically just made I've just created some scenarios that I thought were reasonable. So a high electricity price scenario, just extrapolating the linear trend over the past couple of years, and a low electricity price scenario, assuming prices are going to stay at their 2016 levels. For PV cost, I've just assumed different annual percentage reductions. And these were basically taken from different sources. I looked at what they assumed, and it diverges quite a lot, which is why I used 3 different scenarios. So now I have basically all the parts of my model, and now I just need to calibrate it, which sounds simple, but it's not so simple. So I used cumulative capacity data from from April 2010 to October 2016 to calibrate this. The parameters, as I said, that I want to calibrate are the partial utility weights and the adoption threshold. What I did, first of all, was just do an exhaustive search over the whole parameter space. So every weight can be between 0 and 1. The threshold can be between 0 and 1, with the constraint that the weights sum to 1. And I found that there was really, for each parameter, only one region where they gave good results. But within that region, there was quite a range of weights I could use that still gave quite good outcomes. So to deal with that, I used a method called Approximate Bayesian Computation. And you can read lots about it, and it sounds quite, you know, involved, but it's actually, the process is very simple. I did a very large number of simulation, and by large I actually mean 500,000, so quite considerable, and it really helps here if you have access to some kind of supercomputer or high performance cluster. I would not recommend trying to run this on your laptop. And those model runs were done by sampling parameters from what I defined as the prior distributions. So the prior distributions are shown as the dashed lines in the plot, and I just said, this is the best value I found in my exhaustive search. I'll put a normal distribution around that, and that's what we're going to sample from. That's what I think my parameters should be. Did a large number of simulations, and then keep only a very small subset, so 1,000 simulations, that best fit the data. And the parameters that were used to generate those model runs were kept as the posterior distributions, and those are shown in the solid lines. So you can see that most of the means haven't changed very much. Most of the distributions have gotten a bit narrower, which is an encouraging sign. And then, so those are the posterior distributions. And then when I run the model, I don't just set the parameter as a certain value, I allow it to choose from the allowed set of posterior distributions, of posterior parameters. So the idea here is really that I don't know with 100% certainty what the weights and the threshold are, and I can't know because the model runs are stochastic and there's not one best combination of weights and threshold. But there is a mean, and there is some distribution of how I think those weights and thresholds are distributed. And this also allows me to basically deal with sensitivity analysis and uncertainty sort of automatically. So here's the result of the calibration. On the left, we have cumulative capacity over time. The blue line is the real data. The black line is the mean of 100 model runs with weights and thresholds sampled from the posterior distribution. And the thin gray lines are the individual model runs. So it fits really well, but that's not surprising because that was the whole object of this exercise. That's why I chose those weights and threshold. Just as a sort of sanity check, I've also plotted the average capacity over time. So that's just the total capacity divided by the number of installers. Again, the blue line is the real data and the black line is the mean of the model runs. The reason for this is that obviously you could get exactly the same cumulative capacity with a couple of people installing really large systems or lots of people installing very small systems, but it seems like the trend matches. So it seems like the system dynamics are actually quite similar to what happened in real life. But I have to say that does not necessarily mean that the model is correct. That it's quite hard to validate a model like this unless you see how it performs, for the future or in a different, without the training data, essentially. So how do I use the model? As I said, I use populations of 5,000 agents, which are generated, and the characteristics of the agents are assigned according to the realistic probability distributions based on real demographic data. I sample the weights and the threshold from the posterior distributions, and then I run the time evolution. So I step through the time period that I'm considering, the past or up to 2022, in monthly steps, and every month I allow the agents to make a decision about whether or not they want to install PV. And then you collect your results, so it's tracking who has adopted and when they've adopted, so you can track your cumulative capacity, average, subsidy costs, you can track private installation costs as well, you can track what the partial and total utilities are, so whatever you're interested in. And then I repeat that 100 times, and the reason for that is, as I said, the model runs are stochastic, so you don't just want to do one model run because it might be sort of an outlier. As I said, helps to have access to a powerful computer. After you've done all the model runs, you can average your results, and the mean is your model outcome of whatever characteristic you were looking at. And the standard deviation or any other measure of the spread of the model runs gives you a measure of your uncertainty and the sensitivity to the input parameters. So finally, results. So for the historical simulations, as I said, I assume that I know what the electricity price and the PV price are, and I've tried different digression strategies. And digression is, for some reason, just a fancy word that they use, as in the government uses, to mean what is the strategy for decreasing the tariff to the next lowest level. So these are the different things I tried. Reducing it just linearly every month, reducing it by a fixed percentage at the start of every year, or their current strategy, which is basically reducing it every month, but you have deployment caps, so if the capacity available gets exceeded, the tariff reduces more quickly. And then within the strategies, you can obviously you can vary a huge number of things, like how high are the tariffs, how quickly do they decrease at all, when does the policy end, and what's your export tariff, are there deployment caps. So I tried lots of different things, and did about 900 simulations of different policy scenarios, and these are the results. So on the y-axis, we have how much capacity is installed by October 2016. So just think the higher the better on the y-axis. On the x-axis, we have the total amount that it is expected to cost based on expected production. Total amount is expected to cost to subsidize those installations until the end of their guarantee period. So on that axis, basically, the lower the better. Very obviously, if you spend more money, you get more installation. That's kind of a no-brainer. But you can also see that there's quite a lot of spread. So if you say you're willing to spend a certain amount of money, there's quite a spread in how much capacity that achieves. The black dot above which the area is shaded. The black dot represents the realistic scenario. So I've basically modeled the past in the calibrated scenario. So you can see that it's not terrible. If you look at where the spread is, there's a lot of things they could have done that would have been worse, according to my model, but there are also some things that are better. Now, obviously, worse or better is kind of, maybe you think it's better to spend £20 billion but get significantly more installation. But if you want to spend £14 billion, which is what I expect the realistic historical scenario will cost, then the shaded region is what's called Pareto optimal. So it's better in terms of both outcomes. One thing I'm kind of glossing over here is that I'm just checking how much capacity is installed by October 2016. Obviously, if you get a lot of installation early on, you'll have more electricity production over that period. However, I'm only looking at a 6-year period, and hopefully these PV systems will last, 25 years or so. So that becomes less significant in the long run. Oh, sorry. So I've highlighted some alternative scenarios in this shaded Pareto optimal region. Some of them have significantly more installation at higher cost. Some of them are cheaper and have the same amount of installation. So here are those results in detail. I've plotted each of them with real data. There's no real cost data like time dependent available, so that's why I've got simulated real cost in those bottom graphs. The label in the bottom graphs is telling you the number that was plotted on the x-axis of the graph on the previous page. So what do I expect it to cost up to the end of the guarantee period to support all these installations? So one thing I'd like to point out first of all is just that you can kind of see really obviously in these graphs where the problem was with the real scenario, because towards the end of 2011, beginning of 2012, that's when PV prices really started to come down, but the feed-in tariff was still at 48 pence per kilowatt hour. And suddenly people started to realize, wow, this is an amazing deal, like I need to install PV right now. And you can see in the bottom graphs, the dashed black line in all of the graphs that shows the real cost, it just escalated. In like literally over the period of a couple of months, it went from less than 100 million, or from about 100 million to 400 million pounds a year. And that means that right now we are spending, so 2/3 of the annual cost commitment that's being spent on the feed-in tariff scheme is being used to support less than half of the capacity that's installed. And a lot of that was just installed in this like less than 6 months period. And what all of the alternative scenarios have in common is that either they had a much lower feed-in tariff to start with, or they had some mechanism of controlling the cost. So I'll just talk through them. Scenario A actually just has a flat feed-in tariff. It's super simple. It's just 20 pence per kilowatt hour for the whole time of the simulation. So you can see it's pretty smooth. Like most of the dynamics in that line are just due to different PV, how the PV price is changing. And you can see cost is just sort of smoothly increasing. And what it predicts is you'd end up with significantly more capacity and still increasing towards the end for about the same amount of money. The shaded area represents the standard deviation. So, it's important to note with all these results that there is quite a lot of uncertainty in the simulation outcomes. Scenario B, again, is just a very simple flat feed-in tariff, a bit lower this time. That's why it's a bit cheaper and a bit less installation. C had an annual percentage reduction in the feed-in tariff, and that's why you can see those jumps. So at the start of every year, the installation rate really flattens off because the feed-in tariff goes down, and then it goes up again as PV gets cheaper. So you can really see the dynamics. And scenario D, I think scenario D is very interesting because you're getting a bit more installation than in the real scenario. It's a bit cheaper, and this had deployment caps. So there was only a certain amount of capacity available per quarter. And you can see a couple of times where the installation rate kind of falls off, and that's because the feed-in tariff has been decreased because the caps are being exceeded. And the deployment cap is really a very safe way of implementing this policy, and I think that's something the UK government has realized, because that's what they're doing now. Because you can set a hard limit on how much you're willing to spend on your feed-in tariffs, right? Once all the capacity is full, once it's all registered, no one else can install. And that's sort of clear from the get-go. But if you make the caps generous enough, you can still really get a lot of installation. And another thing that is different is in scenario D, people sort of know what's happening. The installer market won't be disrupted by these sudden crazy changes in the feed-in tariff. So I haven't really considered the effect of uncertainty, policy uncertainty in my model, the effect that has on consumers or the effect that has in the installer market, but I think it's obvious to say that these very large cuts in the feed-in tariff and every time there's a general election people are worried about what will happen. That's not good for the installer market, and it's not good for if you want to see decreasing costs, because lots of people go bankrupt, and then if people want to install PV again, there's not enough competition in the installer market. Okay, so those are the historical scenarios. So for the future, I'm already considering 3 different PV cost scenarios and 2 different electricity price scenarios. So I didn't want to consider hundreds of policy scenarios because the results get kind of impossible to deal with. So I've just considered 4 situations that I think are sort of reasonable. So A is basically a baseline scenario. What would happen if there were no subsidies after October 2016? B is the real scenarios. So that's what the government has announced they will do and have been doing so far. So that's quite low feed-in tariffs around, both the feed-in tariff and the export tariff are around 4 pence per kilowatt hour. They're decreasing slowly, and they'll end in March 2019, and there are deployment caps. So only about 50 megawatts per quarter can be installed, otherwise the feed-in tariff goes down earlier. C is sort of my idea of how, if they wanted to, they could extend that. So really it's just the same thing, but for longer. They keep decreasing the feed-in tariff slowly, and there are deployment caps, but for a further 2 years. And then the last situation is D, and that's still quite low feed-in tariffs, but there are no deployment caps, and it keeps running for a bit longer. So I consider all those policy scenarios in combination with the different electricity and PV cost scenarios. So there's quite a lot of information on this next slide. So here I'm only showing the results for one specific PV cost scenario. So this is the case where PV prices are only reducing by 4% a year, which is the lowest amount that I looked at. And as you go from left to right, you can basically say the feed-in tariffs are getting more generous. So A is no subsidies, B is the real scenarios, C is the real extended scenario, and D is no deployment caps, so most generous. So as you go from left to right, you can see that more generous policy leads to more installation, which is unsurprising. The different color lines represent high and low electricity price, and the shaded area again are the uncertainty. So you can see in these future simulations there's really quite a lot of uncertainty. But the general trends still hold. I'd just like to note one thing, which is that one thing that's quite noticeable, especially in scenarios C and D, is that in the high electricity price scenario, you get these kind of jumps at the beginning of every year where the installation rate increases. And that's really just an artifact of the fact that in the model, the electricity price is set per year. So from the agent's point of view, on the 1st of January, suddenly the electricity price jumps up and PV becomes a better investment. Obviously that's not true in the real world, so you'd expect it to be a bit more smooth. And that's why you don't see those jumps in the low electricity price scenario where the electricity price is just flat. Great, so this seems obvious, right? More subsidy, more installation. So here's what happens if we also allow the PV cost to vary. So as you go down the rows, you get lower PV prices. What's really important to note here is the y-axis on these different graphs. So they're the same per row, but they are changing per row. So you are really getting very significantly more installation with lower PV cost. And if you look at the second and third row, so intermediately cheap PV and cheapest PV, what you can really see is that there's very little difference between scenarios A through C. So whether you're not giving any subsidy or you're giving the small amount of subsidy that is being given, there's really not that much difference. The main difference is when people install. So people will install slightly earlier if you give them, 5 pence or so per kilowatt hour. But probably those people would have installed a little soon anyway as PV gets really cheap, or that's what the model is saying. So it's basically saying if you want to encourage people to install 1 or 2 years earlier than they would have, this is useful, But if what you're interested in is sort of long-term growth in the PV market in the UK, it's not that useful. So this is summarized here. So this is just showing the same data as the previous plot summarized. So it's capacity by the 1st of January 2022 for each of the different policy, PV cost, and electricity price scenarios. So key point here, the different colored lines are the biggest difference, and that's the different PV costs. Secondary driver is electricity price, that's the solid and dashed lines. And then policy is only the third most important thing. The only policy that seems to actually do anything significant is the most generous one, where you don't have any caps, but you also run the risk of like real cost escalation, which is basically what happened, in 2011. So this is total subsidy cost. We already start at 14 billion because that's what was already committed for earlier installations. But you can see if PV costs reduce quickly and there's no deployment caps, you can end up spending, almost 20 billion pounds or in the region thereof. Right, so those were all my results. So my conclusions are that you can model the effect of feed-in tariffs with an agent-based model, and I used it to do policy assessment and capacity projections. The feed-in tariff policy was really erratic, and that led to some cost escalation in the past. And there are logical alternatives that, at least according to the model, have better outcomes. Current and future feed-in tariffs are so low that they have almost no effect, and by far the most important driver is decreasing PV cost. A sort of really crude way of putting this is that if you are going to commit to subsidizing something, really do it. So the issue with the current feed-in tariffs is that they're so low that it's not really risky, because the amounts of money they're spending on top of what was already committed, we're going from 14 billion to 14.8 billion or something. It's kind of insignificant, but it's also having an insignificant effect. So this seems more of a sort of a way of continuing the feed-in tariffs and saying we really care about renewable energy, but it's not really affecting the market very much. So, they should either really subsidize it, or, it's you're just spending a little bit of money to do almost nothing. So what would be interesting to do next? So as Ned said, this isn't really the topic of my PhD, but it would be interesting to update the model and see how it compares with reality for the period where I've done projections. So it's hard to do this already because there's a bit of a lag in when the PV cost data and stuff becomes available. But in the next few years, it would be interesting to see if the model tracks at all with reality, and also adapting it to other countries or regions. So I've had some interest from people saying, "Oh, I would like to use your model for, Malta or Germany." So thank you for listening. Here's a plug for my paper, a link that anyone can use, and also all the code for the model is on GitHub, and you can look at it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Phoebe, for a tour de force of agent-based models. And I think some really good news for those of us working to reduce the cost of PV. It's our job to do that, drive the cost down, and get the installations up. Folks, we've got some time for questions, so do we have any questions? Andrew?
A question about the model. You mentioned that it's hard to it was hard to to test the model after training. Have you considered, before starting anything, splitting the data in a test and training set?
Yeah. Yes. So I think if you literally take all the data on individual installations and then split it in half, that doesn't really make a difference, because unless you've taken a sort of, if you split the data correctly, then really those should be almost indistinguishable samples, right? So that wouldn't make a difference. The only thing I guess that would make sense is to split it in terms of time. So do, for instance, 2010 to 2013 as your training data, and then you can check. But basically, there just weren't enough data points if I did that, or that was my feeling, that it was that wasn't enough information. I think if you, for instance, did this with Germany, where you've got 18 years of data, that would be a really interesting thing to do.
Yeah, sorry, like at the start it was mentioned that UK's feed-in tariff applies to anything that's lower than 5 megs.
Mm-hmm.
Does that also mean there's no implication on whether or not it's behind or in front of the meter, that kind of thing?
Sorry?
Like, does it matter if the system is installed behind the meter or in front of the meter?
You mean the your electricity meter?
Yeah, exactly.
Or I don't know, to be honest. I think it depends. So I think it depends, because I would say most of the PV systems are installed, behind, and as it turns out, almost all of the systems are PV systems. But if you have, like, I don't know, anaerobic digestion or something, you probably don't have that in your house. I don't know if there are any rules about that.
Okay. So, like, if some project developer makes like a 4 megawatt solar plant, that still goes under the tariff.
Yeah, I think so. The maximum allowed capacity depends on the technology as well. But yeah, so you can have a 50 kilowatt PV system, right? You're not going to put that on your roof, but you could register it under the feed-in tariff, and it could be anywhere. It doesn't have to be. So, like, businesses are also allowed to use this, or communities. So a community is allowed to, like, pool together, buy a PV system and register it. It's just that larger installations, I've only shown the two levels for 0 to 4 kilowatts and 4 to 10 kilowatts, but the rates keep decreasing as the systems get larger.
Right, that's an interesting regime. Also, just another thing, after you determine the appropriate weights that you want to use in your final cluster of simulations, does those weights, like, apply for all the household, all the agents in your model, or do you also change them depending on their income?
No, the weights and the threshold are, like, completely universal.
Okay.
So I was in a couple of papers I read about this there are similar agent-based models for other countries and other technologies. Some of them did fit weights depending on, like, demographic groups, but then I think you're really getting into sort of tricky territory with overfitting, right? Because if you say, oh, the weights can vary per agent, oh, now I have 100 free parameters. I thought 4 was enough. Yeah.
I think it's interesting to see that one can try and model the behavior of people,
Yeah.
but and it makes me wonder. You spend a lot of time then finding this weighing the weights, right? But then you have enough fitting parameters that I would start wondering, just like when you're trying to fit anything with a spline, you eventually can do it, right?
Yeah.
So I wonder if can you explain how is it that this is not the same, where you have enough fitting parameters that eventually you'll fit your data, and that doesn't mean that it actually predicts the future, right? It just fit the data that you have up until now. How can one know that this is not the case? That you have so many variables.
Yeah. I mean, the honest answer is really that you can't know until you test your model against data that had nothing to do with the fitting, right? So until I look at what happens in the future, what's the PV cost like, does that track at all with the model? I guess I would say that I'm fitting 4 parameters, which is not a huge amount. And also you can just look at the model outcomes, which seem reasonable, right? It's really hard to know, though, are these the real factors that people consider? Like, when I was building the model, I tried to do it as much as possible, thinking about what would someone who is installing PV, like, what information, would they actually have access to, right? Some models consider things like amount of carbon emission avoided, and I don't think people actually really care about that much. For instance, people might say they care about green investment, but really they only want to do it if it's a good investment, apart from a couple of, like, Elon Musks. But I guess my justification is I don't think 4 parameters is too many to get into the territory of this is definitely just sort of a fluke. Also, the fact that there weren't any other, I scanned the whole parameter space and it didn't seem that there were other points that also fitted. There did seem to be something special about these regions. But whether that's the truth or not is hard to know without external validation. And like personally, obviously I really hope that the model is true, but I also think it would be really interesting if someone tried to apply it to a different situation. And I am open to the outcome of that. I would say I'm not extremely defensive about the sort of truth or not of this model. I hope that it's true and that you can draw some conclusions from it. I think it would be really interesting to see how it does in a couple of years' time.
I guess a quick follow-up then. As you mentioned, you came up with a model thinking, what is it that people would do, right?
Yeah.
But then I could turn it around and say, well, but then if you could see that certain parameters are very important, could you give that information to the policymakers so you actually educate the decision, the people, so that, educate, bias them so that they make the decision that you want according to your model? Can that be?
Yeah, I think so, because I am assuming in my model that people know what the feed-in, or can know what the feed-in tariffs are, and how much PV costs. And of course, that's information that's easy for everyone to find out, but a lot of people might not bother, right, finding that out. So I think definitely the obvious one being PV cost. If you talk to a lot of people, they still think PV is like really expensive, and that's not true anymore. And I wouldn't go so far as to say that for most sort of households in the UK, it's an amazing investment right now to install PV, just because installer costs are pretty high and it's not very sunny in the UK. But I think educating people about PV costs and just showing them a simple, like, look, you would spend this much, and then you would save this much on your bills, and you would get this much in feed-in tariffs, would absolutely help, because I've assumed in the model that people know those things or bother to check them, and a lot of people don't because they've heard PV is expensive.
Well, Phoebe, thank you so much for your presentation. Phoebe is going to be around for the next 2 days.
Yeah.
And so if anyone's got any follow-up questions, you can grab Phoebe and discuss her work. And I think if there are any people who are thinking of establishing a feed-in tariff, then Phoebe's model might be worth having a look at, or at least you might want to get in touch with Phoebe. So Phoebe, thank you. That was brilliant.
Thank you.